On a ready flight from Chicago to Reykjavik, a single father slept in seat 11C. Everyone around him, he was just another exhausted passenger who hadn't slept enough in days. Then the captain's voice cut through the cabin, urgent and unlike any routine announcement. If there are any military pilots on board, please identify yourself immediately. The cabin froze. No one moved. The man in seat 11C opened his eyes and understood that the past he had buried to protect his son was calling his name. Why would a single dad be the one an entire flight was waiting for? 4 hours earlier, David Reyes had boarded Nordic Air Flight 218 with nothing but a battered backpack and the kind of exhaustion that comes from being both father and foundation to a 6-year-old boy. He found seat 11C without looking at anyone, slid into the window seat, and let his head fall against the cool plastic of the wall. The woman beside him was already asleep with an eye mask on. That suited David fine. He wasn't looking for conversation. He was looking for sleep. The flight attendants moved through their safety demonstration while David closed his eyes. He had made this trip once a month since taking the logistics coordinator job with a shipping firm out of Chicago, flying to their Reykjavik office for meetings that could have easily been video calls. But corporate insisted on in-person quarterly reviews, and David needed the salary more than he needed to argue. So he took the red-eyes, slept when he could, and got home to LI as fast as possible. Sleep came quickly. The hum of the engines became white noise. The cabin lights dimmed, and David Reyes disappeared into dreams he would rather not have. In the dream, he was back in the cockpit of an FA-18 Hornet, the sky around him black except for the glow of his instruments. His call sign crackled through the headset. Marlin. They had given him that name in his 3rd year with the squadron, back when he still believed he would do this forever. He had fought for every flight hour, one of the few Latino aviators in his carrier air wing, and he had never once let that make him fly smaller than anyone else. The stick felt right in his hands, the way it always had, like an extension of his own body. And Ali's voice cut through the static, small and worried. "Daddy, are you coming home?" The cockpit dissolved. He was standing in their kitchen in Evanston, still in his flight suit, and Eli stood in the doorway in dinosaur pajamas. He was 3 years old in this memory. It was the night David told him he was leaving the Navy. "I'm coming home, buddy," he had said, "and I'm staying home." Eli had looked at him with wide, serious eyes. "Promise?" He woke to the sound of the captain's voice, not the calm, rehearsed tone of a standard announcement. This was clipped and tight, the kind of voice that makes people sit up straighter. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Elaf Stotir. We are experiencing a technical situation that requires immediate attention. If there are any military pilots on board, particularly fighter or fleet aviators with experience in manual flight under emergency conditions, please identify yourself to a flight attendant immediately." Around him, passengers were looking at each other, murmuring. The woman beside him pulled off her eye mask and sat up straight, scanning the cabin to see if anyone was standing. No one was. The murmurs grew louder. Someone 2 rows back said, "What kind of technical situation?" David sat very still. He knew what that announcement meant. He had heard enough emergency traffic in his 11 years of service to recognize the controlled panic underneath the captain's careful words. This was not a drill. This was the kind of request you only made when something had gone very, very wrong. His first thought was Eli. He was home with David's sister, Camila, who stayed over whenever he traveled. Eli would be asleep by now, his stuffed narwhal tucked under one arm, the hallway nightlight throwing its soft blue glow across his room. If this plane went down, he would wake up tomorrow and find out his father was gone. His second thought was that he could help. 11 years flying Hornets, over 1,800 flight hours, night carrier landings in weather that would ground most commercial crews, battle-damaged aircraft brought home when the radio told him to eject. He was trained for chaos. His third thought was the promise, the one he had made to Eli the day he hung up his wings. No more risk. No more deployment. No more nights when his son had to wonder if he was coming home. He had walked away from all of that to be the father Eli needed. Steady. Present. Safe. But if he did nothing now, there would be no coming home at all. The cabin was getting louder. The man across the aisle was gripping his armrests, breathing hard. Someone's voice rose above the others, demanding to know what was happening. David heard the sharp click of seatbelts being unfastened, people shifting, panic starting to spread like something alive. The flight attendant appeared at the front of the cabin. She was compact, maybe mid-30s, black hair in a tight braid, and the kind of calm professional expression that comes from years of handling turbulence and crying infants and difficult passengers. Her name tag read Freja. "Please remain calm and stay in your seats," Freja said. Her tone was firm but not unkind. "We are following all safety protocols. If anyone has military flight experience, please make yourself known now." She moved down the aisle slowly, making eye contact row by row. David watched her. She passed row 9, row 10. When she reached row 11, her gaze landed on him. For a moment they simply looked at each other. Then she moved on. In his mind he saw two images side by side. Eli asleep in his bed. Eli at a funeral, too young to understand why his father was never coming home. David stood up. Freja turned immediately. The nearby passengers went quiet, watching. David stepped into the aisle and moved toward her. "I was a Navy fighter pilot," he said quietly. Freja's gaze swept over him. A tired man in a rumpled flannel shirt and jeans, unshaven, dark circles under his eyes. Nothing that said anything other than exhausted passenger. "You're saying you're military?" "I was. Got out 4 years ago." "Do you have any identification? Anything that proves your service?" David shook his head. "I don't carry my old ID anymore. Haven't since I got out." "Sir, I need you to understand something. If you're not who you say you are, if you're panicking or confused, or trying to help in a way that makes things worse, people could die. Do you understand that?" "I do," David said. "And I'm telling you the truth." Before Freja could respond, a voice came from behind David. "Let me talk to him." A woman stood up from seat 12A, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, with the kind of bearing that never fully leaves someone who spent decades in uniform. Colonel Patricia Marsh, retired, Army Aviation. Did joint exercises with Navy squadrons for 15 years. She crossed her arms. "If you're legit, you'll answer a few questions." Patricia didn't waste time. "What aircraft did you fly?" F-18 Hornet. "Total flight hours?" "Just over 1,800. "Which air wing?" "Carrier Air Wing 2, out of Naval Air Station Lemur." "Give me 3 emergency procedures for a total hydraulic failure." David's answer came without hesitation. "Engage the backup power unit. Transition to manual reversion. If both systems are gone, use differential engine thrust for directional control." Patricia studied him for a long moment, then turned to Freja. "He knows what he's talking about. That's not something you fake." Freja looked between them, weighing risk against risk, doubt against desperation. Finally she nodded once, sharply. "Come with me." David followed her toward the front of the plane. The other passengers watched in silence. They heard whispers rising behind him, speculation, fear, a child's voice asking, "Mommy, is the plane going to crash?" As they reached the cockpit door, Freja stopped and turned. "I'm taking you up there because we don't have another option," she said quietly. "But if you do anything that puts this flight in more danger, I will remove you myself. Understood?" Freja knocked twice, pressed the intercom. "It's Freja. I'm bringing someone in." The door unlocked with a soft click. The cockpit was small, cramped, lit by the glow of dozens of instruments. Captain Elif Stotir sat slumped in the left seat, her face pale and slick with sweat. A man in a cardigan knelt beside her, checking her pulse. "Dr. Samuel Okafor," he said quickly. "She's had a cardiac event. Not a full arrest, but she can't fly." In the right seat, First Officer Ben Whitaker gripped the yoke with both hands, knuckles white. He looked barely 30, and when he glanced back, David saw fear poorly hidden beneath training. "Who's this?" Ben asked. "He's a fighter pilot," Freja said. "Former Navy." "Can you fly this?" David stepped closer, already scanning the panel. Warning lights blinked in a pattern he recognized. The autopilot display showed a red X. Hydraulic pressure gauges were falling. He could feel the slight yaw in the plane's attitude, the way Ben was fighting it by hand. "Your fly-by-wire failed," David said. "You're in manual reversion." Ben's eyes widened. "How did you?" "Bank angles off by 20 degrees. Airspeed's down. You're correcting manually." David looked at the hydraulic gauges. "And you're bleeding pressure on both systems. How long has it been like this?" "About 8 minutes, Ben said, voice cracking. "I've got maybe 600 hours total. I've never seen anything like this." David moved to stand between the seats, reading the situation the way he'd been trained to read a combat scenario. Fast, clinical, without emotion. You're doing fine, but you're going to need help. Fuel state? Ben checked. Enough for Reykjavik. Barely. David shook his head. You won't make Reykjavik, not with a dual hydraulic failure. You need the nearest field with emergency response. Where are we? Reykjavik's about 180 miles out. That's your option, David said. But you need to let me help you get there. Freyja stepped forward. You're sure? David turned to her. For the first time since waking, he felt the fear loosen its grip, not because the danger was smaller, but because he recognized this feeling. The place where everything comes down to training, instinct, and the will to trust yourself when there's no other choice. I can do this. Freyja held his gaze for 3 long seconds, then stepped back. Do it. David moved to the jump seat behind Ben and sat down. Through the windscreen, nothing but darkness and stars. Somewhere far below, the North Atlantic stretched out, black and endless. Somewhere far behind, Eli was asleep, safe, unaware his father had just broken his promise. David pushed the thought away and focused on the instruments. There would be time for guilt later. Right now, 64 people needed him to remember who he used to be. All right, David said. Let's get everyone down. Ben reached for the radio, hand fumbling the switch. Keflavik Tower, this is Nordic 218. We are declaring an emergency, requesting immediate priority clearance. The response came back within seconds, calm and professional. Nordic 218, Keflavik Tower, copy your emergency. What is the nature of your situation? Ben glanced at David, who took over. Keflavik, we have a dual hydraulic failure, and our captain is incapacitated. We're operating in manual reversion. We need crash and rescue standing by. A brief hesitation, then the controller's voice, tighter now but still controlled. 218, understood, clearing all traffic. Runway 02 is yours. Emergency services moving into position. Current position and altitude? David read off the coordinates. We're approximately 200 miles southeast of your position, flight level 390. We'll need to begin descent soon. Copy that, 218. We'll guide you in. Souls on board? 158 passengers, 6 crew. Understood. We're ready for you. Ben set the radio down. What do we do now? Now we start bringing her down, David said slowly. We can't afford sharp movements with the hydraulics this compromised. Every input has to be smooth. Behind them, Dr. Okafor was still kneeling beside Captain Elafstotir. She's stable for now, but she needs a hospital soon. Working on it, David said, turning back to the panel. Both hydraulic gauges continued dropping. They were running on fumes and backup reserves. He did the math in his head. Based on the rate of decline, they had maybe 35 minutes before total failure. Freyja appeared in the doorway. The passengers are getting restless. They want to know what's happening. Tell them the truth, David said without looking away. We're diverting to Keflavik. We'll be down in under an hour. Tell them to stay calm and follow instructions. Freyja studied him a moment. Will we make it? David met her eyes. Yes. He said it with more certainty than he felt, but Freyja seemed to accept it. He nodded and disappeared back into the cabin. Ben began the descent, easing the nose down by fractions of a degree. The plane responded sluggishly, fighting him. David watched the instruments, calling out corrections. You're dropping too fast. Pull back half a degree. Ben corrected. The descent rate smoothed. Good, hold that. They worked in silence for several minutes. Then the plane shuddered, a violent tremor that rattled the instruments and threw Dr. Okafor against the bulkhead. What was that? Ben asked, alarm rising. David scanned the panel. Turbulence. Atmospheric disturbance. It happens. You're sure? I'm sure. But his gaze stayed locked on the hydraulic gauges. The pressure had dropped another notch. They were running out of time faster than he'd calculated. Ben started to pull back on the yoke, instinct taking over. David reached out and put a hand over his. Don't. You'll stall us. Ride it out. Trust the plane. Ben's hand trembled. For a moment, David thought he might ignore him. Then Ben forced himself to relax, keeping the yoke steady. The turbulence passed. That's exactly right, David said. Ben let out a shaky breath. I've never been this scared in my life. Fear's not the problem, David said. Panic is. You're doing fine. In the cabin, things were deteriorating. Freyja moved through the rows trying to maintain order. But the calm she'd projected earlier was starting to crack. Phones were out, some recording, some texting. A man in the back was demanding answers. Colonel Marsh stood up and moved to the front, raising her voice just enough to carry. Everyone needs to settle down. I know you're scared. I'm scared too. But the people up front know what they're doing. The best thing we can do is stay quiet and let them work. A younger man in his 30s, reeking of duty-free whiskey, pushed into the aisle. His words were slurred. Who put you in charge? We're all gonna die because they let some stranger into the cockpit. Colonel Marsh stepped toward him, posture shifting into something harder. Sit down. I want to talk to the real pilot, not some. Freja appeared between them. Sir, return to your seat immediately. Not until someone tells me what's really going on. His voice carried through the cabin. A child began crying. The simmering panic threatened to boil over. Dr. Okafor emerged from the cockpit, his medical bearing giving him automatic authority. He moved to the man and spoke in a calm, clinical tone. Sir, I'm a physician. I've just examined the captain, who's had a cardiac event and cannot fly this aircraft. The man helping us right now is a trained combat aviator. If you continue this disturbance, you put everyone on this plane in greater danger. Do you understand? The drunk man stared, mouth working soundlessly, then sank back into his seat, bravado deflating. Dr. Okafor looked around the cabin, meeting as many eyes as he could. I know you're frightened, but we have someone up there who knows exactly what he's doing. The best thing you can do, for yourselves and each other, is stay calm and follow instructions. We are going to get through this. The cabin quieted, not silent, but manageable. Freja gave Dr. Okafor a grateful nod and returned to the cockpit. So bad out there? David asked. Holding. Barely. David turned back to the instruments. Then we move faster. He leaned toward Ben. I need you to hand me primary control. Ben's head snapped around. What? I can't just... You've done great, but we're about to start final approach, and I've done this before. You haven't done this. I've done things like it more times than I can count, David said, voice firm but not unkind. This isn't about protocol. This is about getting everyone home alive. Ben looked at the instruments, then at Captain Elafstotir slumped in her seat, then back at David. Finally, he nodded. Okay. What do I do? Keep monitoring the instruments. Call out anything I need to know. Be my second set of eyes. Can you do that? Yeah, I can do that. David shifted forward and took the yoke. The moment his hands wrapped around it, muscle memory kicked in. Heavier than a hornet stick, less responsive, but the principle was the same. He was in command now. Freja watched from the doorway. You're sure about this? I'm sure. He eased the yoke forward, adjusting the descent angle. The plane responded, sluggish but obedient, the hydraulics fighting him the whole way. Keflavik Tower came back on the radio. 218, you're 70 miles out. Descend to flight level 250. Winds light, visibility good. Clear approach ahead. Copy Keflavik. Ending to 250. David brought the nose down another degree. The altimeter began to unwind. 39,000, 36, 35. The plane shook again, a long rolling vibration through the floor. Pressure just dropped again, Ben said. System 1's at 15%. System 2's at 10. David's jaw tightened. They were losing it faster than hoped. How much longer can we hold control? Ben checked. Maybe 20 minutes, maybe less. 20 minutes. Keflavik was still roughly 35 minutes out at their current speed. The math didn't work. David's mind raced through alternatives. They could increase the descent rate, get down faster, but that would strain the hydraulics harder. No good option, only less bad ones. We're coming in faster and steeper than normal, David said. It's going to be rough. It's the only way. Ben's voice cracked. So rough. Rough enough that everyone needs to be strapped in tight. Freja was already moving. She stepped into the cabin and raised her voice. Everyone, listen to me. We are beginning our descent. Return to your seats immediately. Fasten your belts as tight as they'll go. Heads down, brace position. Do it now. Passengers scrambled to comply. Seatbelts clicked. A few people prayed quietly. Others sat white-knuckled and silent. Two older men across the aisle from each other reached out and gripped hands over the gap, faces calm and resigned. Back in the cockpit, David adjusted the throttle and increased the descent rate. The nose tipped forward. Airspeed climbed. The altimeter spun faster. 25,000. 20. 15. Hydraulic pressure at 8%. Steady, Ben said, voice focused now, fear pushed aside by something stronger. Discipline. Training. David's hands moved over the controls with practiced precision. He had done this 1,000 times in his mind, in simulators, in the sky over deserts and oceans. The specifics were different, but the principle was the same. Stay calm. Trust your training. Fly the plane. The radio crackled. 18, Keflavik Tower. You're 20 miles out. We have you on radar. Maintain heading. Cleared for emergency landing. Runway 02. Keflavik. 20 out. David could see lights now, faint and distant, glowing against the darkness. Iceland's coastline. Somewhere down there, people waited with fire trucks and ambulances and prayers. Pressure at 5%, Ben said. Not yet, David said. Just hold a little longer. The plane bucked hard, a sudden violent jolt that threw Dr. Okafor against the bulkhead. He caught himself and steadied Captain Elaf Stotir, who groaned softly. David fought the yoke, forcing the nose back down, holding course. 4%. David didn't respond. His entire focus was on the lights ahead, growing larger, brighter. The runway was out there. I just had to reach it. 3%. The plane was shaking now, a continuous tremor rattling teeth and blurring vision. Sweat ran down his face. In his mind he saw Eli's face, heard his voice. Daddy, are you coming home? 2%. We are on final approach. David said into the radio, voice calm and controlled. Nothing in it betraying the fear clawing at his insides. Copy 218. Cleared to land. Emergency services standing by. David could see the runway now, a long strip of lights cutting through the dark. It looked impossibly small, impossibly far. He adjusted the descent angle, felt the plane resist, forced it down anyway. 1%, Ben said quietly. I know. The runway rushed up. 500 feet, 400, 300. The plane was screaming, every rivet and weld straining against forces it was never built to handle. 200 feet. The hydraulic pressure gauge hit 0. We just lost everything, Ben said. The controls went slack, lifeless. I'm going to use differential thrust, David said. More power on one engine to turn, less on the other. It's going to be rough. Ben stared at him. You can't land a commercial jet like that. David's gaze never left the runway. Watch me. He adjusted the throttle on the right engine. Felt the plane yaw slightly left, corrected with the left engine. The plane wobbled, fighting him, but it turned. He was flying it the way he used to fly a damaged fighter. Trusting instinct and feel over instruments and automation. 100 feet. The runway filled the windscreen. David pulled back on the throttles, killing speed, letting gravity take over. The plane dropped. 50 feet. In the cabin, Freja braced herself against a seatback. Passengers screamed. Someone recited a prayer under their breath. The two men across the aisle gripped hands tighter. 20 feet. Come on, David whispered. Come on. 10 feet. The wheels hit the runway. The impact jarred through the entire aircraft. A bone-rattling thud that threw passengers against their belts and rattled the overhead bins. Front gear first, then rear, and the plane bounced once before slamming back onto the tarmac. Metal screamed. The fuselage shook violently. They were on the ground, but they were moving too fast. Far too fast. We don't have brakes, Ben said. We're not going to stop. Flivik, we need the arrestor bed, David said into the radio. Where is it? The controller's response came back immediately. 18. The arrestor bed is 3,000 feet down the runway on your right. Guide lights will direct you. Turn into it when you see the markers. David scanned ahead. In the darkness, he could just make out a series of amber lights offset to the right. The arrestor bed, a strip of engineered material designed as a last resort for aircraft that couldn't stop. Hold on, David said to Ben, then raised his voice. Tell Freja to brace everyone. This is going to be rough. Dr. Okafor disappeared through the cockpit door. Seconds later, Freja's voice rang through the cabin. Brace positions now. Heads down. Do not lift your heads until we've stopped completely. David adjusted the throttle, increasing power to the left engine while cutting the right. The plane began to veer right, sluggish and unwilling. It pushed harder, demanding more from engines never meant to steer. The nose swung slowly toward the amber lights. The runway blurred beneath them. David could see the arrestor strip now, a darker band against the concrete, angled to catch overshooting aircraft. It cut power to both engines completely. Felt the plane slow slightly. Nowhere near enough. We're not going to make the turn, Ben said. Yes, we are. David maxed the left engine one more time, felt the plane shudder and twist. The nose came around, pointing directly at the arrestor bed. Then he killed the engines entirely and let physics take over. The front wheels hit the arrestor material and the world exploded into noise. The deceleration was instant and brutal, like hitting a wall. The plane lurched forward, throwing everyone against their restraints. In the cabin, passengers screamed. Metal groaned. David braced against the panel as the cockpit pitched forward. Beside him, Ben was thrown against his harness, gasping. The plane skewed sideways, the fuselage twisting as the material grabbed unevenly at the wheels. For one terrible moment, David thought they would flip. Then the resistance evened out and the plane straightened. They slowed, and then they stopped. The silence afterward was total for several seconds. No one moved. No one spoke. David's hands were still locked on the yoke, knuckles white, tendons standing out like cable. He forced himself to breathe, to let go, to look around. Ben stared straight ahead, face bloodless. We're down, he said, like he didn't quite believe it. We're actually down. David leaned back in the jump seat, his whole body shaking. Adrenaline dumped through his system, leaving him weak and hollow. Behind him, Dr. Okafor let out a long breath. That was the single most terrifying experience of my life. David turned to look at him. How's the captain? How's the captain? Okafor checked her pulse, her breathing. Still stable. She needs a hospital, but she's going to be okay. Through the cockpit door, David could hear the cabin erupting. Crying, shouting, laughter, all at once, chaotic and joyful and relieved. Ben unbuckled his harness with trembling hands and turned to David. You just saved 164 lives. David shook his head. We saved them. You kept us in the air when it mattered. Ben reached out and gripped his shoulder. Thank you. The cockpit door opened fully and Freja stepped inside, her professional composure cracked, tears streaking her face though her expression stayed controlled. She looked at David for a long moment, then nodded once. You did it, she said quietly. David stood on legs that felt like water. We all did. Outside the windows, emergency vehicles converged on the plane, lights painting the darkness in flashes of red and white. Firefighters in protective gear surrounded the aircraft. Paramedics wheeled gurneys across the tarmac. The rear door opened, and the emergency slides deployed with a hiss of compressed air. Freja moved back into the cabin to begin the evacuation. David followed. Passengers were standing now, gathering belongings, helping each other toward the exits. Many were still crying. Some were already on phones calling loved ones. Dr. Okafor coordinated with paramedics who boarded to stabilize Captain Elaf Stotir for transport. Colonel Marsh stood near the front directing traffic, making sure families with children went first. When she saw David, she crossed the aisle and extended her hand. Hell of a job. I mean that. David shook it. Thanks for backing me up. She smiled grimly. I write a column for a veterans magazine. I'm going to write about this. Fair warning. Leave my name out of it. Too late for that, friend. Half this cabin already has video. David moved past her toward the exit, but passengers kept stopping him. A young father holding a toddler pressed his hand and whispered, Thank you. An older woman clapped him on the arm. You're a hero, son. The two men who'd held hands across the aisle nodded at him through tears. We're going to see our daughter's wedding, one of them said. Because of you. Something broke loose in David's chest. He nodded, unable to speak, and kept moving. A drunk man from earlier sat slumped in his seat, sober now and pale. When David passed, the man looked up. I'm sorry for what I said. I was scared. David stopped. It's okay. We all were. At the exit, Freja stood by the door helping people onto the slide. When she saw David approaching, she stepped aside. You should go first. David shook his head. You're the senior crew. This is your plane. Freja's expression softened. Not anymore. It's yours as much as anyone's. She gestured for him to go. David stepped to the doorway, looked down at the slide, the ground below, the emergency workers waiting. Then he sat and pushed off. The slide was fast and steep. He hit the ground, stumbled, caught himself, and walked away from the plane. The night air was cold and damp, tasting of ocean salt and jet fuel. He kept walking until he was clear of the emergency vehicles, then stopped and turned to look back. The plane sat half buried in the arrestor bed, listing slightly, engines silent and dark. Emergency crews swarmed over it, and down the slides came passengers one after another, stumbling onto Icelandic soil and into the arms of waiting medics. David watched them and thought about Eli, about the promise he'd made and broken, about the person he'd tried to stop being, and the person he'd just become again. If only for a few hours. A voice behind him said, "You look like you could use a minute." He turned. Freja stood a few feet away, arms wrapped around herself against the cold. The professional mask was gone now. She looked exhausted, raw, human. "Are you okay?" David wasn't sure how to answer. "I don't know." Freja moved to stand beside him, both of them watching the evacuation continue. After a moment, she spoke again. "I didn't trust you. Not at first. Even after the colonel vouched for you, even after you answered every question right, I thought you might be lying, or confused, or dangerous." "I know. But you weren't. You were exactly who you said you were." She turned to look at him. "Why didn't you stand up right away, when the captain first made the announcement? You didn't move at first. I saw you. You were thinking about it." David was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I have a son. He's 6. He's got his mother's laugh and my stubbornness. 4 years ago, I promised him I was done flying, done taking risks, that I would always come home." Freja nodded slowly. "But you stood up anyway." "Because if I didn't, I wouldn't have been coming home at all." David looked down at his hands. They had stopped shaking. "I spent 11 years flying missions where every launch off that carrier could have been the last time I saw my kid. I walked away from it because I didn't want him growing up scared every time I left the house. And tonight I did the one thing I swore I'd never do again." Freja was quiet, then said, "Your son's going to hear about this. Someone on that plane has video. It's probably already online. He's going to know what you did." David felt his throat tighten. "Yeah. And when he finds out, he's going to know his father is someone who keeps his promises. You promised him you'd come home. And you did. You just made sure 157 other families got to keep that same promise." David didn't respond. He couldn't. Behind them, the last of the passengers slid down to safety. Emergency crews began securing the aircraft. Somewhere in the distance, ambulances pulled away, carrying Captain Elaf Stotir and a few passengers who needed medical attention. Freja touched his arm lightly. "Thank you, David, for trusting us, for letting me trust you." He walked away, back toward the other crew members being gathered for debriefing. David stood alone in the cold Icelandic night and pulled out his phone. He'd powered it off before takeoff. Airline policy. Now he turned it on and waited for it to connect. 14 missed calls. 31 texts. All from Camilla. He dialed. He answered on the first ring. "David, oh my God. Are you okay?" "I saw the news." "Eli doesn't know?" "I didn't want to wake him." "Are you?" David closed his eyes. "I'm fine. Everyone's fine." "Is Eli asleep?" "Yes. Went down at 8 like always." "David, they're saying you landed the plane. They're saying you saved everyone." "I need you to do me a favor," David said. "Don't tell Eli about any of this yet. Let me tell him when I get home." Camilla's voice softened. "Of course. When will you be back?" "I don't know. Soon. There's going to be debriefing, probably some interviews, but I'll get back as fast as I can. He's going to be so proud of you." David ended the call and stood in the darkness, watching the emergency lights flash across the broken plane. In a few hours, the sun would rise over Iceland. In a few days, he'd be home, and he'd have to look his son in the eye and explain why his father was all over the news for doing the one thing he had sworn he'd never do again. But that was a problem for later. Right now, he was just grateful to be alive. 3 days later, David walked through the door of his own house in Evanston, and Eli slammed into his legs before he'd even set his backpack down. "Daddy." Eli's voice was muffled against David's stomach. "You're on TV. Aunt Camilla said you're not allowed to watch it, but I watched it anyway." David crouched down so they were eye level. Eli's hair was sticking up on one side the way it always did after a nap. And his eyes, David's late wife's eyes, dark and serious, searched David's face like he was checking for something. "Are you mad?" "No, buddy. I'm not mad." "Were you scared?" David thought about lying, the way he might have a week ago. Instead, he said, "Yeah, I was really scared." Eli considered this with the grave seriousness only a 6-year-old can manage. "But you came home." "But you came home. Oh, the promise still counts." David felt his throat tighten the same way it had on the tarmac in Keflavik. "Yeah, bud. The promise still counts." He pulled Eli into a hug and held on longer than he needed to, breathing in the smell of shampoo and grass stains and everything ordinary and safe. Over Eli's shoulder, through the front window, he could see Camila standing in the doorway, arms crossed, smiling at both of them like she'd been waiting 3 days to breathe normally again. Later that night, after Eli had finally fallen asleep, 3 stories and instead of the usual one, and a promise that tomorrow they'd get ice cream and David would answer every single question about airplanes. David sat alone on the back porch, with his phone lit up with messages he hadn't answered yet. Reporters. A producer from a morning show. A text from Ben Whitaker that just said, "Made it to my sister's wedding rehearsal because of you. Thank you doesn't cover it, but thank you." Another from Freja. "Captain Elaf Stotir is recovering well. She wants to meet you when she's back on her feet. So do I, for less dramatic reasons." David didn't answer any of them yet. He just sat in the dark, listening to the quiet hum of the neighborhood, and let himself feel, for the first time in 3 days, like a man who had kept every promise he'd ever made to the person who mattered most. Somewhere above the house, a plane passed overhead, blinking its way west, and David watched it until the lights disappeared behind the trees.